A couple of days ago, I have ranked all of the ranged weapons in RimWorld, and there's been some interesting results, so maybe you should check that video out. But today, we are ranking all of the melee weapons in RimWorld. I'm gonna be ranking all of these based like they're all normal quality, and let's just say all made out of steel, so you know they're the same basic quality. Sure, some weapons are better if they're made out of plasteel, some are better if they're made out of uranium. I'm gonna mention that along the way, but for this ranking purpose, let's say all of them are made out of steel and normal quality. Of course, you can't really make beer out of steel, but you get the idea. Now let's begin. First on the list, we have the axe. This is a decent all-around cutting weapon. It is comparable to something like a Gladius. It's pretty much middle of the pack. It's gonna deal some decent damage. It can chop off some limbs, but it's nothing too special. I think it's perfect representation of a B tier. Next we have beer. Yes, a beer bottle. You can use it to smash someone's head in, but let's be real, if you have to resort to actually using beer bottles to fight enemies, you are in big old trouble. Sure, it might be better than using just raw fists, but still, as far as the weapons go, this is F tier. Next we have Breech Eggs. This is one of more situational weapons. It doesn't really do that much damage, but it is very good against buildings. Now, of course, raiders are going to come with this and they're going to try to open up your base, but that's fine. We're talking about what we're going to use it for, and there's a couple of situational uses. If you have a mech cluster on the map, you can use this to destroy the turrets faster. Sure, the turrets are going to shoot at you, but you know, if you get there fast enough, you can actually take this out pretty fast. Also, if you're trying to go maybe raid some other colony yourself, then you can use this against their walls or their turrets. So we're gonna put this into B tier. Next, we have the club. This is the early game basic fighting stick that is really easy to make. And if you don't have anything else, well, you might go with this. Might be better if you go with knives because they're also cheap to make. But you know what? For early game, it's a decent hit and stick, and we're gonna put it into C tier. Next we have the elephant tusk, another bit stranger weapon. Well, it's pretty decent weapon for early game, you know. Of course it gets outclassed later on, but it's also very hard to get your hands on. If you're trying to use the early game, you need to actually go and defeat an elephant, which might not be that easy. Of course, if you have some ranged weapons, then that might be simpler, but still, we're gonna put it into C tier. It's not really a weapon you wanna be fighting around with, but it's okay. Next, we have the LTAC stuff. Now, this bad boy, it's not really meant to be used in melee combat. It is for the pawns with psychic powers, so the best thing you can do is not go in melee with those and be a supportive pawn, standing behind your lines and supporting your people with your psychic crazy powers and not actually bringing this to battle. If you really are in melee and fighting with us, you're not really going to do well, so this bad boy is going to be in F tier. Next we have Gladius. Gladius is another really good all-around weapon. You know, mid-game you're going to be loving this bad boy. You're going to be fighting everything really with it, but it kind of gets outclassed later on and it falls off against armor. Of course, against armor, blunt weapons are going to be better than the Gladius, but if you're using it mid-game, there might not be that many enemies that have a lot of armor, so it's going to be still pretty decent and pretty solid. We're going to put it into B tier. Next on the list, we have Ikwa. This is another Neolithic weapon, which is basically a spearhead on a very short stick, and it's used as a knife. Now, the problem it has, well, it does deal a bit more damage than a normal knife. It's harder to make. Well, knives you can just, you know, make at a crafting spot. For this bad boy, you actually need a smithy, so it's, you know, harder to make. And at the point where you can actually make a smithy, you can make better weapons than this one. So it was really not that amazing. We're gonna put it to C tier over here. Next, we have a unique knife that I have almost forgotten about. This is the Jade Knife, and the only way you can get it is from the Lost Tribe scenario, the scenario where you start as the tribes people. It's a fancier version of a knife, really. It's not really gonna serve you well in combat, and it's not there for you to do that, but if you don't have anything else, hey, it might be useful. We're gonna put it in the C tier. Next, we have the knife. These bad boys are extremely cheap to make and can be very useful very early on, you know, for stabbing things up. But let's be real, once you leave the Neolithic era and can actually make yourself a smithy, Gladius is just slightly more expensive, very cheap for what it is, and it's just much better, and it outclasses the knife. So we're gonna put the knives out here into C tier. Next on the list, we have the long sword. This is just a better version of Gladius that will chop up all lightly and medium armored enemies and will really serve you well, especially if you can make it out of plasteel. It's gonna be great. It does fall off against, you know, very heavily armored enemies, like somebody in marine armor, because this is mostly sharp damage, and, you know, most heavy armor has really good sharp damage protection, so it can struggle there, but otherwise this is a great weapon and it's in A tier. Joining the longsword in the A tier is the mace. Now, the mace is actually not nearly as useful in general as the longsword, because longsword can really be used against any enemy and just chop them up. Mace really shines when it's made out of uranium and it's used to fight heavily armored opponents, because it's gonna do some serious AP. It's gonna have good armor penetration. It's gonna do some good damage. So in that regard, you know, heavily armored enemies, if you're fighting them, make some maces, you know, get some of that if you're not using guns or something like that for some reason. Very decent weapon. Next, we're getting some crazy royalty DLC weapons, and first we have Monosaur. This thing does incredible damage. It has really good armor penetration, and it will basically chop up any enemy. Sure, it's gonna have a bit of a worse time against really heavily armored enemies, you know, as other sharp weapons, but really in that regard, it's barely outclassed by anything. It's still an amazing sword, deals amazing damage, and if you get the Persona version of it, that thing does even better. So this one clearly is S tier. You can't really make it yourself, so you'll have to buy it or take it off the enemies. So very much worth it, good weapon. Then we have the Plasma Sword, another of the royalty DLC craziness. This bad boy, while it doesn't have quite as much damage and AP as the Monosword, it sets people on fire when you fight them. So what do people when they're on fire do? They run around like headless chicken, and you can have other people shoot them in the back because they won't be fighting back. So Plasma Sword will pretty much win any one-on-one fight. It's amazing like that, because, you know, fire can be very useful when you're trying to fight in melee. So yes, another crazy weapon that's really good. If you get the Persona version, even better. So Plasma Sword goes up here into S tier with Monosword as well. Then we get back to some more normal weapons. We have the Spear over here. This one is another middle of the pack weapon that can do some decent stab damage and go past armor. It's, you know, very decent. It's got solid damage, you know, it's straight up middle of the pack compared to Gladius somewhere out there, and it's gonna be in B tier. Next, we have the Thrumbohorn. Now, this bad boy is actually a really decent weapon for very early game, you know, same like the Elephant Tusk, because you have to get it, same as the Elephant Tusk, off of an animal. But the thing is, if you get to use this in early game, you must have taken down some Thrumbos, which are very strong, very powerful, do a lot of damage, and you probably have some better weapons if you manage to take them down. And even then, while it does good damage, you're probably better off selling this and just buying a bunch of guns, or even better swords or something like that. So while Thrumbohorn can actually do well in combat, it's better used otherwise. We're gonna put it in B tier. Next, we have the Warhammer. This bad boy is quite slow, but it deals blunt damage, so it's very solid against heavily armored people. But if you're not fighting people with heavy armor, you're better off going for something else that's gonna chop up and be much faster in combat, because this bad boy is pretty slow. And even if you try to make these for like blunt weapon fighting, you're definitely better off making some maces and something like that. So Warhammer, not an amazing, but we're gonna put it up here in the top of C tier. Next, we have wood. It's a piece of wood to smack somebody over the head. What did you expect? It's not really good. It's, you know, comparable to beer bottle. While beer actually has some value for drinking, I mean, wood doesn't really have any value. It's another F tier weapon over here. Probably even better if you just use your bare hands. But, you know, if you've got nothing else, well, wood is gonna do, right? Last but certainly not least, we have the Zeus Hammer. Now, this bad boy is another one of those crazy royalty DLC weapons. If you get the Persona version of it, it's even better. Now, this one also has a special effect. It doesn't have as much damage or AP as the Monosaur, but it does have a special effect. That is, when you hit something, it has an EMP blast. So this is perfect if you're trying to fight some mechs, because with the EMP blast, you're gonna stun them. Yeah, and of course, if you're trying to fight some turrets, you can stun the turrets as well. And in that regard, it's pretty amazing. You know, I wouldn't really use it against other enemies. I would rather go for one of these two against normal humans. But against mechs, really good. We're gonna put it up here in the S tier. And that concludes my melee weapon ranking for RimWorld. Let me know what you think. What would you put into S tier? What would you put into F tier? Do you disagree with something that I have put up here into, I don't know, whatever row? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you haven't checked out the range weapon ranking yet, check it out here. For now, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.